Welcome, everyone, to our regular weekday morning podcast on Kabbalah for Heretics. Pleased to see all of you. This, of course, is your heretic in chief, Yakov Leib HaKohain. Let me remind you all, as I do every morning, we have been engaged in this project for almost 30 years. Every weekday morning, and sometimes weekends, excuse me, hope the sneeze didn't shake anybody. We've been involved in this project for literally the past 30 years, almost 30 years, where we have been systematically going through the Zohar every weekday morning, volume by volume, page by page, sentence by sentence. And fortunately, for the most part, those have been recorded, so we have them as a record of the project. Going in that direction, we have systematically finished cover to cover, volumes 1, 2, and 3, and are now only a page or two away from finishing volume 4. Of course, when we finish volume 4, we will begin the 5th and final volume of the Zohar, God willing. And just so sit back, that's going to take some time. This is not going to be, as you can see, it's been almost 30 years. And that's been about 5 or so years on every volume. It's taken us about 4 or 5 years to go through cover to cover each volume. Let's get back to where we left off in the last podcast. We're in the book of Leviticus, Shmini, and it says, "If the Holy One, blessed be He, takes pride in Israel, how can they go and defile themselves and cling to the other unclean side? Therefore it is written, quote, sanctify yourselves therefore and be you holy, for I am holy." This is a discussion of the laws of kashrut that we've been in, and the spiritual meaning of kosher, not the mistaken popular notion that it deals with health and cleanness and so forth. It does not. It's totally spiritual. And in the last podcast, I gave, I think, conclusive evidence that it is totally spiritual and not for health reasons. Well, let me give you one example again. The question can be asked, are fish kosher? And the answer is, fish with scales are kosher. Fish without scales, such as eels and sharks, are unkosher. Now you tell me, what is there about fish with scales that makes them safer to eat from a health standpoint than the poor eels and sharks? Totally spiritual, and the spirituality of the laws of kashrut are being described here. If the Holy One, blessed be He, takes pride in Israel, how can they go and defile themselves? That is to say, eat unclean food. Remember, as it's going to say, God says to them in Leviticus about all these kosher and unkosher, clean and unclean foods, be holy as I am holy. In other words, this is what God would eat and not eat. Therefore, if you want to imitate God and come into the presence of God, eat what God would eat and do not eat what God would not eat. If the Holy One, blessed be He, takes pride in Israel, how can they go and defile themselves and cling to the other unclean side? Now this goes beyond just the food. There is a certain kind of positive and negative energy in kosher and unkosher food. There is a positive energy from the right-hand side of God in the kosher foods, so that you are putting positive godly energy into yourself when you eat them. There is a negative, unholy, from the side of death energy in the unclean food. Now, of course, anybody coming up out of the 60s and 70s will understand that, because there was the famous saying, and I think there still is among the culty folks, you are what you eat. And indeed, you are what you eat. If you eat these spiritually clean foods, you will be spiritually clean, or at least it will contribute to that. If you eat the unclean foods, you will become spiritually unclean. Therefore, it is written, sanctify yourselves, therefore, and be ye holy, for I am holy. This is the imitatio Dei, the imitation of God. Everyone talks about wanting to know God. I want to know God. I want to stand in the presence of God. But they don't want to do the things that the Zohar and other sacred texts from all religions tell us we have to do in order to stand before God. Are you following me? Here's one of the things that you can do. Now, the question is raised, does that literally mean that everybody should keep kosher? And believe me, it's complicated to keep kosher. It's not just not eating milk and meat together, and it's not just not eating pork. Well, there's a question about that. For years, until years and years, I kept strictly kosher in my eating. I, to some extent, still do, but what I discovered when I made this great discovery is that one can keep kosher virtually. One does not have to do it literally. And besides, these laws of kashrut are abrogated by the Messiah. Jesus abrogated the laws of kashrut and made everything clean to eat. So did Sabbatai Zevi. It's very important in each of their messianic missions to do that. If you remember, Peter has a dream in which an enormous sheet appears before him as he's sleeping on the roof of a building. And in it is every unkosher animal possible. And a voice announces, "Up, Peter, kill and eat." And Peter says, "Lord, nothing unclean has ever passed my mouth." And the voice again says, "Up, Peter, kill and eat. From now on, you may eat these things." Sabbatai Zevi not only receives the same permission, but grants it to everyone by pronouncing his own blessing upon unclean foods and eating it in front of everyone. And the blessing is, "Blessed art thou, Lord our God, who makes the forbidden things permissible." You better believe that's what he said. But that's exactly what God was saying in Peter's vision. He was making the forbidden things permissible. This is a central concept in esoteric messianism, both Christian and Jewish, making the forbidden things permissible. Why do that? What do you mean, why do that? I mean, of course, there are always people who will ask, why do that? The reason is because that transforms evil into good and good into evil, so there is no longer good and evil. There is only one thing, God Almighty. Not an old man sitting on a throne or a handsome young guy hanging from a cross, but a totally inward spiritual reconciliation of God. One of the great divisions in God is between the clean and the unclean, between the left and the right-hand sides of God. Those are to be reconciled. Keeping kosher is a way of reconciling them until one really is instructed by God to reconcile them by breaking the commandment of keeping them separate. How can you unite two things while keeping them separate? Good and evil. How can you unite good and evil if you keep good and evil separate from each other? You cannot. You can only unite good and evil by entering into the evil. Not physically necessarily, not literally, but at least virtually. And embracing the evil. Not pushing it away, not trying to destroy it, but embracing it. In our last podcast, I mentioned the crucifixion of Jesus as one of the best examples of this in the Bible. Jesus literally embraces death, enters into and embraces death in order to unify it with life. Literally, as he's hanging from that cross and dying, he is virtually, inwardly, uniting that death which he is embracing. Jesus embraced death on the cross, did not push it away. Transformed the evil by literally, virtually embracing it. Now, as I always point out when I mention such things, this does not mean in any way whatsoever that Jesus was God. He was not. God was in him mightily. The Mashiach, Yechid the Mashiach was in him. But that did not make him the Yechid the Mashiach, but only the bearer of it. As I always say, the bird cage is not a bird simply because a bird is in the bird cage. So let's keep that in mind. We are not justifying the divinity of Jesus in anything we touch and anything we teach. He was an enormous mystic. He was in the line of those who did what they needed to do in order to bring about the coming of the Messiah. And in that sense was himself the Messiah. But the Messiah is not God. Mashiach is not God. Now, Christians have altered that, have perverted that to make the Messiah God. He's not God. Godly, but not God. The carrier of God, but not God itself. The dispenser of God's holiness without being God's holiness itself. Happy the portion of Israel, of whom it is written, all that see them shall acknowledge them, that they are the seed which the Lord hath blessed. Listen to that. They are the seed. All who see Israel, all that see them shall acknowledge that they are the seed which the Lord hath blessed. Now that means more than you think it does. There are two seeds in Genesis. In Genesis 2, God creates man and woman, and he blesses them, but he does not ensoul them. And right after that, in Genesis, it says, so there was not yet a man to till the ground. So God created a second Adam from the dust of the ground, and into that Adam he breathed the soul, the breath of life, and that Adam became a living creature. Now this could mean one of two things, or both. It means that even the unensouled Adam, even the descendants of Nachash, are blessed. Even evil is blessed. That's what it's saying. Even evil is blessed. Not for its own sake, but because it is the bedrock out of which good comes. In the study of other great texts of oral Torah, it says very clearly that good emerges out of evil. We must reach into evil and pull out the good that is in it. Whoever eats of these unclean foods clings to the sitra achra, the other side, the side of evil and unholiness, and defiles himself, and shows that he has no portion in the Most High God, and comes not from his side, the right-hand side of God. I mean, when you look at the Ten Sephiros, what the hell do you see? A bunch of circles with ambiguous words in them? The Ten Sephiros are a roadmap of the mind and being of God. And if you look at them that way, which you are supposed to, you see that God's consciousness is divided between the left and the right. There are those who come from the left-hand side of God. That is the descendants of the seed of Nachash. And there are those who come from the right-hand side of God. That is from the seed of the second Adam and Eve. And if he departs in this state from uncleanliness, who punish him as a man spurned by his master, and there is no healing to his defilement, and he never escapes from it. Look at Cain. Cain never escapes from his defilement, from murdering Abel. He bears that mark on his forehead forever. Forever. The idea is not to rid the world of that evil, but to mitigate that evil, to join it with the good which has come from it, so that it is whole and neither good nor evil, but God reunited. King Solomon wrote in his wisdom, quote, all the labor of man is for his mouth, unquote. This signifies that all the punishment which a man undergoes in the other world is on account of his mouth, because he did not guard it, and through it defiled his soul. He ate of the left-hand side of God and defiled himself by doing that, rather than eating of the right-hand side of God and becoming more holy in spirit. Also, it's not just that he did that, it's that he did not do what we are charged with doing. That is to say, to reunite the two sides of God, to reunify God, who is in a terrible state of disunity as a result of creation, of creating the world and man. For one to defile himself with unclean foods is like worshiping idols, just as he who serves idols quits the side of life and of the domain of holiness for another, opposite domain. So likewise he who eats unclean foods is defiled both in this world and the next. For these were assigned to the idolatrous peoples, the offspring of the first Adam and Eve, who are already unclean and come from the side of uncleanliness. And you thought kosher was just not eating pork. And you thought kosher was just not eating milk and meat together. And you thought kosher was totally a health measure. Bullshit. We'll stop here for this morning. And of course, we'll resume our learning from the Zohar, where we left off, from where we just stopped. In the meantime, let me mark my place. There we go. All right, we have some technical recording people here. The only people who were invited to these recordings are the people who record them and edit them and post them. So let me ask of them, do you have any comments or questions that might reflect the comments and questions of the 5,000 people in our listening audience? Because that's what we're up to right now. Raise your hand if you have a comment or question. Yishai, David, Tommy. David is away. He's serving double duty. He's recording this session, but also working at his job. So he has none. And I see Tommy has no comment or question. That's fine. Remember, this is not a class. People are not invited to come to this. Only those who record, edit, and post them on our YouTube channel are invited. Those others of you are more than invited to listen on the YouTube channel to this and other podcasts. All right, go ahead, Yishai. There we go. All right, Yishai. Powerful detailing of this prescription from in there to enter into evil and transform it, to rejoin it with good, reuniting God with Himself, though there's no good or evil, nothing to do with dietary danger, but for spiritual reasons, for God's sake. Excellent. Thank you so much, Yishai. Well, that concludes our podcast for this morning. And as I do every morning, let me conclude it by reciting the sacred Kaddish, the ritual prayer for the dead, in honor of the departed soul of our beloved friend and fellow Kohen, Leonard Cohen. Yiskadal v'yiskadash shmei rabo, Bolmo divro chirusei v'yamlich malchusei, v'chayachon v'yomechon v'chayei d'chol beis Yisrael, bagalo uvizman korei virmu amen. Yehei shmei rabo meverach le'elam u'me'omayla. V'yisparach v'yistabach v'yispa'ar v'yisamam, v'yisnasei v'yisadar v'yisalei v'yisalal. Shmei d'kutsha b'richu, le'elam mincha b'irachasa tishvechasa, v'nechemasa dameran bolmo v'imru amen. Yehei Shlomo Rabba min Shemaya, v'chayinu aleinu v'yakol Yisrael v'imru amen. Osei shalom b'mramov, hu ya'asei shalom, aleinu v'yakol Yisrael v'imru amen. And let everybody please say amen. All right, that concludes our podcast on the Zohar for this morning. Remember, it will be available for listening on our YouTube channel. So you can go and listen to it there if you want to listen to it again. In the meantime, Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha.